Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Anika Rao. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Weathering the Storm, Ecological Security in a Changing World, and we are excited to hear from Professor Matt McDonald. This event is sponsored by the Department of Political Science and the student-run Policy and Diplomacy Society. It is presented as part of the Warmoth Endowed Lecture Series. This endowment makes possible symposia, lectures, and initiatives that are at the intersection of international and American politics. We want to thank Professor Brent Steele, the Francis D. Warmoth Presidential Chair, for his leadership on this event. Now I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Matt McDonald is a professor in the School of Political Science and International Studies and faculty in the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. After completing his PhD at the University of Queensland in 2003, Matt held lectureship posts in international relations at the University of New South Wales and the University of Birmingham in the UK, and was associate professor in international security at the University of Warwick. His research focuses on critical theoretical approaches to security and their application to issues such as environmental change, Australian foreign and security policy, climate politics, and Asia-Pacific security dynamics. He's published on these themes in a wide range of journals. He was formerly co-editor of Australian Journal of Politics and History, and he's currently completing an ARC-funded project on comparative national approaches to the climate change security relationship, and is currently leading the cross-disciplinary university research network, Climate Politics and Policy. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Thank you so much for that, Annika. I really appreciate the introduction, and thanks to everyone for turning out today, and in particular the Hinckley Institute for this kind invitation, and my good friend, Professor Brent Steele, who's not only helped facilitate this, but also ensured that I'm fully cognizant of all the appropriate restrictions around where I can get craft beer and where I can drink it in this fine state of Utah. Thank you very much. I would like to note, obviously, the Hinckley Institute was due to host the presidential debate. I'm probably a distant second in terms of priorities in that space. I didn't actually follow the first debate with any great depth, but based on what was reported to us in Australia, I've been really happy wandering the streets to see that some pets have managed to survive the migration to this country, despite what we heard about the claims in the debate itself. If I was presenting this in Brisbane, in my hometown of Brisbane, a fellow Olympic city come 2032, we would begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land. We would begin by acknowledging the Yagra, the Turrbal people. We would acknowledge that Brisbane, where we're located, is Meanjin. We would recognise and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging within those Indigenous communities. And I mention this not only because I think increasingly you get this as a common thing in public events, including major sporting events in Australia. Not only does it help us recognise actually there is a history of colonisation, of dispossession, and at least in the Australian case, genocide when it comes to Indigenous people, but on this particular topic, it seems especially important for me to recognise this when thinking about environmental change, because arguably so many of the drivers of environmental change are around the nature of the relationship we have to the environment itself. And I had the pleasure of presenting with Brent on a topic that we're working on, a paper that we're working on looking at comparative Indigenous approaches to fire management compared to national approaches. What's really striking is that this notion of the separation between humanity and nature that is so central to Western political thought and to the way in which societies like ours organise ourselves is actually really inconsistent with Indigenous cosmologies, not just in Australia and not just in the United States, I've learned from Brent's research, but really throughout the world, that this notion of a separation between humanity and nature doesn't really make sense, that Indigenous populations are more likely to express this relational connection to the place that they're from, to understand how the ecosystems in which they live are actually functioning and what those ecosystems need. And that sort of humility, that level of understanding is arguably something that's been lost in settler colonial societies and dominant approaches to the way in which we think about environmental stewardship, and is arguably for many part of the driver of problems like climate change that I'm going to be spending a bit of time talking about today. So, with that said, my focus today is largely on this intersection between climate change and security. Annika kindly mentioned an ARC, that's Australian Research Council project that I'm working on, looking at comparative national approaches to this. How do different countries make decisions around whether climate change is a threat and which sets of responses we should pursue? But this particular project is a little bit different. It's outlining essentially the foundation of my most recently published book on ecological security. So we see increasingly, I'm not going to spend much time talking about climate change itself. I'm assuming we're on the same page that climate change is a problem, climate change is happening. Climate change is here with us already. We've already seen temperature increases of over 1 degree Celsius. That's had effects already in terms of natural disasters, both the intensity and frequency of natural disasters, desertification, ocean acidification, availability of fresh water, changing ecosystem functions, and with it challenges to biodiversity throughout the world. So climate change is a problem. I won't spend a lot of time talking about how exactly it constitutes a challenge. That's something for the international relations lecture that I'm giving soon after. So I'm going to focus here more on this idea that climate change can and should be approached as an issue of security. So increasingly we see recognition that climate change constitutes a security issue. We've seen a range of debates within the UN Security Council since 2007. There was actually a draft resolution on the table in late 2001 that Russia vetoed, but nonetheless we've seen an increasing level of engagement with the idea that the UN Security Council, a key institution for maintaining international peace and security, should have a position on climate change and acknowledge responsibilities in this space. We've seen the establishment of the climate security mechanism within the United Nations in 2018. We've seen prominent debates about the role of climate change in contributing to displacement and potentially even conflict in the context of conflict in Darfur and Syria, for example. And climate change, by some accounts, features in over 70% of states' national security strategies, as in states do actually formally acknowledge climate change constitutes a threat. We also see lots of attention in academic circles. The think tank community has been really engaged in sort of drawing attention, policymakers' attention to the idea that climate change constitutes a threat to national security, especially some of the think tanks based in DC, and a lot of academic work increasingly in this space as well. But a lot of that academic work focuses on, lots of the attention is both analytical and normative, so asking should questions. On the former, on analytical questions, the dominant approach is to ask how exactly does climate change contribute to instability or conflict? Does it warrant being considered a security issue, and if so, on what basis? On the latter, the question of whether it's a good thing to define and approach climate change as a security issue, the focus is often, is securitization, is presenting and approaching this issue as a security issue, is that actually a good thing? And does it really help mobilise or responses or speak to different constituencies who might otherwise be unmoved by, the plight of poor people in other parts of the world, but are concerned about national sovereignty, for example? So does it help to mobilise different and speak to different audiences, or is it something to be avoided because this risks militarisation, because defence sectors aren't necessarily well placed to deal with this issue, because it encourages problematic responses to the nature of climate change itself. This latter question, is approaching climate change as a security issue a good thing, isn't the right question to be asking about the connection between climate change and security. And in my work, I make the case that what matters isn't whether climate change is viewed as a security issue, but crucially, in terms of making sense of the implications of securitization, what's important is how security is understood and defined. So I distinguish in my work between different discourses of climate security with different choices of referent object, i.e. whose security matters. And these discourses have different implications in terms of sets of responses that they encourage to deal with those issues. This is really important to note, and it helps explain my engagement with security as a concept, because security is really central to the political legitimacy of key actors. It helps define the importance of particular issue areas. So based on that, my argument is that we should actually engage with security and assess the normative and practical implications of different accounts of security in international relations. So this builds, Annika was kind enough to note work I've done on security theory. This builds in important ways on my work on security theory. In particular, the arguments that I've tried to advance around the idea that security is constructed, political and ethical. It's constructed in the sense that security is ultimately given meaning in particular empirical contexts through dynamic processes. Over time and by different communities, security is understood in different ways. And we know this intuitively from thinking about differences between how different countries understand the potential security implications of nuclear weapons or a nuclear program in Iraq in 2003, for example, or we know intuitively that there can be a massive difference between, in terms of public policy responses to national security if Donald Trump is elected relative to Kamala Harris, that they have very different conceptions of what constitutes a security threat. Obviously, Donald Trump would be more likely to view immigration as a threat potentially to security, but climate change not as a particularly important issue. With the Biden administration, we've seen the inverse. So we sort of intuitively know that different political communities, for lots of really complex reasons, understand what it is that they prioritise in terms of their security, what it means to be secured, and this can change over time. Second, security is political in the sense that the promise of providing security is central to the legitimacy of the key actors of global politics. The promise of providing security is literally central to the social contract as why states exist. This idea of individuals giving up some degree of autonomy to the state that in turn provides for their protection. And even the UN Security Council, of course, the first point in the UN Charter is to note that its central purpose is the maintenance of international peace and security. So key institutions of global politics genuinely define their reason for being in terms of the promise of providing security. And linked to that, approaching an issue as a security issue arguably then prioritises or presents that particular issue as being significant, as being worthy of significant action in response. Finally, security is ethical in the sense that different security discourses, different choices over whose security matters, are built on different ethical choices, and the practices they encourage have different sets of ethical implications. Recognising these three elements of security really encourages us, I think, to explore how security is given meaning in different political settings. So how is it constructed? And Brent, among others, has made a contribution to that literature. To recognise the importance of the meaning given to security in politics terms, and to make a case for the way the meaning and practice of security might be shifted in progressive ways. And that's largely the context in which ecological security sits. So when it comes to climate change, to put it really crudely and simply, some discourses of security are better than others. We see, and in previous work I've attempted to sort of develop a bit of a typology of how different discourses of security prioritise the nation state, international society, people and ecosystems, distinguishing between national security, international security, human security, and finally ecological security. So if our focus is on national security and we're concerned about the potential implications of climate change for national security, we're more likely to be thinking in terms of the development of adaptive responses to indirect sets of threats. So rather than thinking how is climate change at present causing an immediate harm to ecosystems or people in different parts of the world, we're more likely to be thinking how is our sovereignty or territorial integrity potentially undermined by the indirect effects of climate change through things like population displacement. This was really captured in a 2004 Pentagon commissioned report that said for countries like the US, it may be the case that actually one of the key effects of climate change might be that states like the United States might seek to more effectively patrol the borders to prevent those displaced from the effects of climate change from reaching American shores. So in this context, you have a response to the national security implications of climate change that basically says, build a bigger wall or make border security more effective. This is, by most accounts, a kind of perverse response to the effects of climate change that isn't necessarily linked to making the types of changes to address the effects of climate change. Similarly, an international security focus encourages more of an emphasis on potentially mitigation through international cooperation, but is still really focused on this idea of how do we preserve the current international status quo. And this is problematic for many simply because the international status quo may not necessarily be worthy of preservation when it comes to having overseen a lot of these problems of climate change in the first place. In this context, human security constitutes an obvious response, but the focus there is still on presently living human populations. We don't see a focus in this human security discourse on future generations nor other living beings who are the most vulnerable, least responsible and most directly affected or compromised, but also the least able to influence a response. So back in 2013, I developed this typology and actually had one of the reviewers for the journal essentially say to me, look, this is a helpful typology, but it does seem that you like one of these discourses more than others, and encouraged me at the time to sort of say, all right, well, what exactly does this ecological security discourse mean? How do you give it content? How do we imagine it coming into fruition or informing the way in which consequential political communities might actually think about the security implications of climate change? So that was essentially the project then that formed the foundation for this book. When thinking about the relationship between climate change and security, what constitutes a defensible approach that encourages appropriate practices that address the problem itself? And my answer to this was essentially ecological security. So having outlined in the book itself, having outlined the approach to security in theory, what I've briefly presented here in an initial chapter, and different discourses of climate security in the literature review, the book then outlines what it is and why it's necessary, ecological security, that's chapter 3. What it means in practice, especially in terms of means and agents, so what sets of practices would encourage and who's undertaking these practices, chapter 4. And crucially in chapter 5, how would we actually get there? So rather than simply say this is something we should aim for, what resources can we identify? What prospects are there for this to actually inform the way consequential political actors think about security? And that tripartite distinction between what it is and why it's necessary, what it means in practice, and how might we get there draws on the late Andrew Linklater's account of critical theory as a concern with the sociological, the normative, and the praxeological. So, what is ecological security? Essentially, when thinking about the security implications of climate change, ecological security encourages us to focus on ecosystem resilience. So an ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. It can be as large as oceans, as small as tidal pools, which is obviously a real challenge for thinking about what it is that needs to be protected in ways that's slightly different from a simple answer that focuses just on nation states. Resilience, which is central to my framework here, is ongoing functionality of ecosystems in the face of change. So resilience is actually a somewhat controversial topic in international relations because it's seen as sustaining an existing order. We just need to try to make sure things continue to function. But of course, the concept itself originally had origins in ecological thought, where the focus is how do we think about the way in which ecosystems and different organisms actually continue to function in the face of ongoing change. Now, the reason we would talk here about a concept like resilience rather than necessarily conservation or balance is precisely because climate change is locked in. We can't talk about how we preserve what we have because what we have is changing as a result of climate change itself, hence the focus there on ecosystems and their resilience. It's not uncontroversial, but it does capture something about the need to come to terms with ongoing change. This discourse orients towards the rights and needs of the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, across time, space, and species. So across time in terms of recognising obligations to future generations, across space in terms of recognising obligations to marginalised and impoverished people who are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change throughout the world, and across species in terms of extending our moral compass to focus on other living beings. So, why is this approach actually necessary? In the work that I've done, I point to the pathologies of thinking of different discourses of security that I've introduced that continue by and large to work with what I was talking about at the outset of this talk, this human nature divide, this idea that actually we're talking about the preservation of collectives, of institutions, or of human communities from challenges associated with our environment. That's particularly challenging in the context now of the mooted arrival of the Anthropocene epoch, which is the geological term, the mooted geological term for the current geological epoch we live in, that is defined by the idea of humanity as a planetary force. So it's this recognition that actually most coverage of the world is actually more now a product of human habitation and human use than it is of original natural space, for example. There's a recognition that we have fundamentally altered the conditions of our own existence evidenced through the problems like climate change. So in that context, it becomes really important for us to think through, not just to recognise that actually different approaches to climate security have these different challenges, but we need to find ways of conceptualising what it is to be protected that comes to terms with the idea that we are embedded in ecological systems in the context of the Anthropocene. We need to recognise interrelationships and the impossibility of closing humanity off from the ecological conditions of its own existence. So in this context, the book draws on a range of different ecological pluralist thought that attempts to move beyond a more unhelpful anthropocentric versus ecocentric divide, as well as feminist thought in making a case for interrelationships as absolutely central. Of course, this is challenging given the complexity of prioritising responses. How do we think about obligations to future generations relative to impoverished people in different parts of the world when responding to an issue like climate change? And given the scale of complexity around ecosystem functions, it becomes even more challenging. So we're even at the point where we can't necessarily say definitively rule out the prospect of large-scale abrupt climate scenarios like the death of the Amazon rainforest or the shutting down of the Atlantic current. These types of things are so difficult even for scientists who spend all their time talking about because of the complexity of ecosystems and Earth and these planetary functions themselves. So that's a challenge, but it's not. It shouldn't necessarily lead us to rule it out. In part, some of these challenges of prioritising different things are evident in all security frameworks and discourses, whether we're talking about national security or international security. But the threats are very much direct and immediate. We're focusing not on whether climate change might cause drought, which then in turn causes displacement, which then might in turn cause instability and violence between different people and then constitutes a security issue. we're looking very directly at how climate change holds immediate and direct challenges to the function of ecosystems themselves. So, then moving on to means and agents. The means of response, mitigation and urgent mitigation action is obviously central, transitioning away from traditional fossil fuel use, and this is urgent given our focus, of course, on immediate and direct effects of climate change. There is clearly a role for adaptation, both of human populations to try to help protect them from immediate harm associated with climate change, but also ecosystems themselves. More controversially still, there might even be a space for us to recognise and engage with the potential use of controversial approaches like geoengineering, whether solar radiation management or carbon dioxide removal. And prior to this, I spent some time talking with some folks at Harvard about this particular issue, and have done some work in the past to try to say to what extent can we recognise a role for these types of things as sort of potentially, not as silver bullets, but as something that buys us more time to minimise harm while we engage in the substantive act of decarbonisation. On these means, though, we also need to ensure a central role for dialogue, humility and reflexivity in terms of recognising that we don't have a model to apply to lots of different political communities about what ecosystem function looks like. We need to engage with local communities to understand these things, engage with Indigenous communities, for example, ensure that we approach these things with some degree of humility, recognising that actually ecosystems are incredibly complex. Reflexivity in terms of recognising that actually some of our well-intentioned practices might not necessarily lead to really effective responses. That becomes important as well. The agents of response, so who is responsible for addressing ecological security in this sense? This is primarily in the book defined in terms of capacity. So this draws on distributive justice concerns, on Tony Erskine's conception of international responsibility, for example. There's some degree of role for individuals in advancing ecological security, but really principally we're talking about states, intergovernmental organisations and multinational corporations. The responsibility for advancing ecological security in the book is understood in terms of the ability of beings to knowingly contribute to climate harms or their amelioration. And the degree of responsibility that they hold is determined by their capacity to contribute to or address climate change. So there's clearly a significant role in this context for states, but also really important to note that different states have different levels of obligation depending on levels of development, for example. So finally then, how do we actually get there? Can we imagine these such a sort of challenging and foreign conception of what it is to be protected that focuses on ecosystems rather than on the state or human collectives? Can we imagine this finding purchase? And in this context, I draw on the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who's spent a lot of work talking about possibilities for agency in structural constraints that might not necessarily appear immediately to be conducive to effective change. I talk here about imminent possibilities, so possibilities for change or for building on some degree of nascent recognition of elements of this discourse in practice. So I make a case in the book that we can see in the endorsement of the precautionary principle some degree of recognition of principles consistent with ecological security. Similarly, common but differentiated responsibility builds on some of the similar ethical commitments around who is responsible for addressing this. Increasing recognition of the Anthropocene epoch is also something that we can build upon in this context, as well as just environmental movements in practice. These are that we see in this context ecological security in practice that we can build upon. We also need, I think, though, to recognise and identify radical alternatives to the current order. So rather than simply say, what is it how can we incrementally change within the existing systems, but to leave ourselves open to say, actually, these systems just don't function as they should. What does an alternative in this context actually look like? So this is an important point in terms of progress and endpoints. We can recognise the importance, I think, of both acknowledging incremental movements towards militaries starting to say, we recognise the need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. We recognise the need to start thinking about about equipment, about procurement, around management of personnel in ways that actually edges towards reducing our boot print. But at the same time, leaving open the idea of where do we want to actually go in terms of what this endpoint looks like. So ultimately, the current challenge of climate change really, I think, requires us to think in fundamental ways, to rethink the way we think of security if we are connecting the two. And it's important for the reasons I noted around the politics of security to actually really interrogate how climate change and security are linked. If we're leaning into that relationship, we can't allow ourselves to just be thinking, how do we insulate ourselves as states, as communities from these external effects of climate change? We need to be thinking through the lens of how do we think about the obligations that we have to future generations, to other living beings, and to the most vulnerable in the world through ecosystem resilience as a central focus. And I make the case in the book. This is less a program that says, all right, these are the rules of ecological security, and more a sensibility. That if we have this framework, if this genuinely informs how the way we think about the security implications of climate change, the sets of practices that are likely to follow are more likely to be progressive ones. So there are big dilemmas and challenges that obviously exist in moving beyond anthropocentrism, in dealing with uncertainty and complexity of the degree we're talking about when it comes to how ecosystems themselves actually function, how we prioritise particular threats and responses to them. Again, that example of how do we think about obligations to future generations relative to immediate needs of impoverished people in the developing world, for example. The politics of getting there is clearly a challenge in terms of thinking about building on existing resources, but also leaving open the idea of thinking of radical alternatives. And there are challenges as well to think about the extent to which this type of framework of thinking of security in very relational terms, in terms of obligations to the most vulnerable, to what extent can this apply to issue areas beyond climate change as a big and live issue? So in other work, I've tried to develop bits and pieces of this project, or tried to give it a little bit more content around institutional prospects for its realisation, around Indigenous cosmologies and how those speak directly to this ecological security project, around, as noted, solar geoengineering, for example. So this is clearly an ongoing project. There is also a forum on the book in the journal New Perspectives that sort of has a range of different academics engaging with the book itself. But most importantly, the book is available for purchase, and with Christmas just around the corner, it really is that ideal gift for that special someone in your life. I shall leave it there.
And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and she'll bring it to you. Just state your name if you're speaking here. We'll start with Chase. Give us one moment to get the mic on.
All right. So, thank you for coming to give us this lecture. It's very nice. I'm curious at first to ask if this might necessarily not just be an American problem, but the idea of how do we break through an ontological barrier to connection with the ecosphere. This idea that perhaps a lot of times the things holding back discussion or rethinking this issue might necessarily be more ontological than it is practical for a lot of people. What do we do about that?
So I think this is a really big challenge. It's not just choices that are made or it's not just frameworks of modern political thought and political theorists talking about this idea of this disconnection between humanity and nature. It's also stuff like, in big cities, whether it's Salt Lake City or Brisbane or others, we often don't know where our water comes from. We don't know where our food comes from. We don't have these immediate connections. I mean, you've got the beautiful Wasatch Mountains behind you, but we don't have that same type of connection to environment that you need or that Indigenous communities are more likely to have and appreciate, understanding the cycle of life in that context. So that's not just, I agree that that's not just a mechanical thing, that's something about who we think we are. And we're encouraged, I think, as modern liberal subjects to precisely think of ourselves as we're in these modern worlds and these things are facilitated for us. I guess this is a provocation to actually, this both points to the problems associated with that way of thinking, but also at the same time encourages us to think, what are alternative cosmologies or alternative frameworks for thinking of our connection to nature? Because we clearly, whatever we're doing now, it's not working. We need these radical changes. So I totally agree that you do get this sense that actually you're talking about almost rewiring how humans in big Western settler colonial states are taught to think about themselves and taught to think about obligations to others, but we need to.
With all that said and done, how would you like to develop a culture of global consciousness?
Culture of global consciousness. Look, it's a good question. I think actually in some ways it's, following on from Chase's question, it's as much around this idea of connections at a local level and actually beginning to rethink how we engage with the spaces that we're in and recognising ecological effects locally. So I would say, someone advances ecological security when they contribute to, local regeneration projects around, their immediate environmental space, and those types of things can actually encourage people in that space to think more fundamentally about the place they're in. That type of shift is arguably a little bit more feasible to imagine than the challenge of radically thinking about what obligations do we have to someone displaced in the Sahel region in Mali as a result of desertification. How do we think about specific obligations to them? I think in the first instance, if we actually encourage people to think about the ways in which their lives are reliant upon ecological functions that actually we're fundamentally compromising, then that's the type of move to make, and that hopefully amplifying voices like Indigenous voices that talk about those connections are ways that are productive ways to actually do that. So I think there's lots of hope, even in the way environmental movements like Extinction Rebellion try to conceptualise the idea of speaking on behalf of nature. There's always these problems with those types of representations, but nonetheless there is a sense that actually we're at a point where fundamentally undermining the conditions of our own existence, much less future generations or other living beings.
If politicians could adopt a regenerative program of your choice, what would you like them to target, like as a small local community level?
So if we are talking about, that was a particularly sorry, I don't want to draw attention to your sneezing, but that was a particularly sort of striking noise that was made. Sorry. I promise I'm not trying to get out of the question. Actually, at the political level, so this is where it's different sides. So if we're talking about global consciousness, if we're talking about how we as individuals start to think about consciousness, that's where you would engage at the local level in terms of how do you connect to the ecological spaces that you're in, that you're reliant upon. How do you sort of school yourself about, where does water come from? And actually that one works a lot better in Australia, where you just assume you're drinking tap water all the time, whereas here there does seem to be more deference to the bottled stuff. But when you're talking about politicians, I would say that's at the level, what I would most like to see is rapid decarbonisation to the extent that political leaders are in a position to facilitate that. They can turn the knobs on things like how do we transition away from existing sort of infrastructure that's reliant upon fossil fuel use. That's the more urgent thing for political leaders to think. How do we rapidly decarbonise in ways that embodies recognition of our obligation to the most vulnerable? And then, you know, the challenge for policymakers is often in that context, how do I try to sell those types of transitions in ways that doesn't just seem like, you know, as we're seeing to some degree in the presidential discussions, that it doesn't just seem like I'm going to drive up power bills and undermine the American economy through rapid decarbonisation. How do you deal with that? And then you sort of are already seeing this kind of, you know, more of a middle ground around fracking and natural gas that's a bit of a cop-out from some of the big decarbonisation and big and urgent decarbonisation challenges that modern societies face. So at the level of political leaders, I think that's where, it depends a little bit on scale, but that's where actually their priority should be. How do we significantly, to the extent that it's in our control, how do we significantly wean our communities and our infrastructure away from anything that relies on fossil fuels? And how do we then sell that in ways that doesn't just undermine the political legitimacy, both of the cause and those who are putting it forward?
My name is Jake, and my question is along the lines of, do you have like a specific strategy to convince my consumerist uncle that like this is the better way to go, to get him away from the consumerism that funds so much of the problem?
Probably not knowing your uncle as well as probably you do. But I mean, this has been something that gets really identified. And I know Brent and colleagues have done work on this. Some of the echo chambers that you get in social media. It's so hard to penetrate this with broadly, you know, even just rationalist sort of arguments that try to draw on an evidence base that try to then say, well, here's the cluster cuss we currently occupy at the moment. What changes can societies make to actually move us in a direction where we're not just pulling the rug out from under impoverished people in the developing world or from future generations or other living beings? It's an incredibly difficult space to penetrate, and it's much harder now because of the media ecosystem. That actually means, I'm not sure if your uncle's bought this book. It actually sounds like a perfect gift for your uncle. So I can sign it as well. I think that it could be a couple of, you could then sell it on for maybe $2 or $3 more on eBay. But yeah, that's one of the big challenges. So we can make these arguments around this is where we should go. And so, I mean, in this context, when I think about how this project sits alongside what I'm trying to do as an academic who's really concerned about climate change, this is largely speaking to an academic audience, pretty much around we need to recognise the dangers and limits of thinking of this climate security relationship solely through the lens of the preservation of insulation of existing communities. In other work I do, I've tried to actually spend a bit more time just sticking the boot into Australian climate policy and pointing to the ways in which there's this fundamental hypocrisy around we claim to be interested in the plight of our Pacific neighbours, while at the same time we're opening new coal projects and exporting coal to other parts of the world. So I think, and you know, with teaching, it's as much around sort of encouraging students, not necessarily ramming anything down their throat, but encouraging students to really think critically about things like that human nature divide, about things like, you know, how do we think about our obligations to the extent that they're out there, and what can we do in this space? So I think that's all a long-winded way of saying it may be that this book is not the silver bullet to get your uncle to change his practice, but that's where we need to box a bit clever and think, well, you know, we need work that encourages us to recognise the big picture limitations of existing ways of thinking. At the same time, we need to engage with immediate and local challenges and encourage people to take some ownership and some agency of those. But I'm not sure if any of that's going to help with the uncle, other than buying the book, which you definitely should.
Are you concerned that there's any potential that framing climate change through a security perspective could potentially be weaponized to actually inhibit international cooperation and even further rhetoric against like climate change immigrants or just immigrants in general? Are you worried about that at all?
Yeah, good question. A little bit. Less than I used to be, actually. Less than I was when I was writing this book, to be honest. In part because of the other project that Akin noted at the start, this project around comparative national approaches to climate security and the more recently the role of the UN Security Council. So that project looks at how countries that have lent into this idea that climate change is a security challenge have attempted to institutionalise some type of response to it. The project looks at, okay, well, what sets of choices have they made? Where is it based in terms of, is it defence or is it foreign policy? Because that changes across different countries. Are they focused on things like preparing the military for more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions, or are they focused on how we reduce the boot print, the emissions of the military themselves? And through that process, but also through the UN Security Council process, what's clear is that we don't necessarily see the really problematic, nefarious implications of securitisation even at the national level to the same degree we might expect. That where you do get countries leaning in to the security implications of climate change, they are often thinking, all right, practically, how do we ensure that we're less reliant on fossil fuels given they're not going to be around indefinitely? How do we think about procurement in ways that allows us to transition fuel types that we're using in different equipment in decades to come? How do we think about preparing our military for engaging in hotter climates, engaging in different types of missions, doing more in the natural in terms of disasters? And the UN Security Council debates, I think, are really telling, because if you look at the states that lined up behind the idea, yes, this is a security issue, yes, the UN Security Council should play a role, they were on the Security Council itself, they were countries that were either vulnerable to the effects of climate change, so some of the elected countries that were developing countries that were acutely vulnerable, like small island states, or they were countries that have traditionally been or are at the forefront of mitigation, of pushing other countries towards international cooperation on mitigation. And if you look at the countries that were opposed in that 2021 discussion in September and then again in December, it was Russia, it was China, it was India. These are countries with really patchy records on climate action and mitigation. And that says something to me. It says that actually maybe we should be less concerned about securitisation. And some of the more conspiratorial arguments around how militaries are just leaning into this as a way of securing their budgets now that it's less clear that, in the post-Cold War world that they're as relevant as they used to be. I haven't really seen that through a lot of the recent research that I've done, which ironically actually in some ways sort of chips away at the foundation of this, which these are all the problems of approaching it in that lens. So I would still say it's much better to think of these implications through the lens of ecosystem resilience. But even when we do see states leading into the national security implications of climate change, we're not necessarily seeing really problematic. In fact, any engagement with climate change in any space, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's security, it's pretty much a good thing, I think.
What are some of the biggest things that you think that politicians should think about before implementing geoengineering, like direct carbon capture and stuff like that? Because places like implementing direct air capture somewhere like Madagascar is a lot different than implementing it here, even though they contribute a lot less to carbon emissions and they suffer, arguably a lot more.
Well, big question, especially because I spent about a week at Harvard has a center of solar geoengineering research, and I've spent a bit of time there because it's a space that I'm starting to work on a little bit more. Geoengineering is usually split between carbon dioxide removal, so things like soil sequestration, carbon capture and storage, which you mentioned, even ocean sequestration. So that's That's carbon dioxide removal. And on the other end of the scale, you have the more controversial stuff like solar radiation management, things like stratospheric aerosol injection, big space mirrors, that sort of stuff. So the stratospheric aerosol injection is usually the one people focus on. That's about the deployment of sulfur particles to effectively try to recreate the effects of a volcanic eruption that have been shown to lower temperatures. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything for things like ocean acidification. And if you stop stratospheric aerosol injection, it will go back very quickly. You'll see this really abrupt change. So it's dangerous and it's really uncertain, but the politics of it are kind of fascinating. It's interesting now that carbon dioxide removal is now seen as absolutely central to most states' pathways to net zero. This has just been accepted that this form of geoengineering is actually what most states, that's part of their targets. And alongside that, part of their how they're going to reach their Paris Agreement commitments, their nationally determined contributions. Solar radiation management, far more controversial. There's a case that actually we should be interrogating some of these carbon dioxide removal strategies far more significantly than we do, and people like Simon Nicholson have been talking about that recently. So it's a really big and really challenging space that encourages us to think. I think fundamentally about, like, do we feel comfortable potentially changing the functionality of the planet, at least when it comes to solar geoengineering. Carbon dioxide removal approaches are probably more controversial or more problematic than we give them credit for. Those types of practices, we should be thinking about some of the costs associated with the infrastructure that's involved and things like that. That's definitely the case. But solar radiation management is a really fascinating space to watch. And it's really telling, I think, that most of the people I spoke to at Harvard were not people who were just thinking, we've got these great toys, it'd be great to do it. We do this, then we don't have to worry about mitigation. We can just kick the decarbonisation can down the road. Of course, we still should be worried that that's exactly what countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia might think about solar radiation management. But most of the people I spoke to were like, look, we're just in a situation of horrible choices at the moment because climate change is locked in. If this could minimise harm, we can't really then ethically, justifiably take it off the table, even while we're going to be really concerned about how it could be governed and how it could actually be deployed and used. So that's probably my next visit to Hinkley, we can talk about that one.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. So you mentioned that you were looking particularly now at indigenous approaches. Are there any indigenous approaches that you've seen that you think could work well, and how do we implement them in our current society?
So obviously, so this is a fairly new area, and it's as much, again, the sensibility that I'm interested in, like how they're different cosmologies that have a different conception of time. Like, so we're not thinking of time as linear and at the moment, but we're thinking in terms of future generations. We're thinking also in terms of ancestors and connection to place and past. And then that notion of country, how that encourages sets of practices. So the paper that Brent and I are working on really looks at how dominant Western society, in Western societies like the US and Australia, there tends to be, when we focus on fire, the focus is really aggressive suppression. How do we stop fire from ever happening? And actually a lot of practices undertaken by Indigenous communities, both in the US and in Australia, systematically minimise the possibility of large-scale disasters like that, because fire isn't necessarily seen as inherently problematic. It serves lots of different functions, and they have that perspective because they have this deeper connection to place and what the ecosystem they're in responds to. Sometimes you need fire to help minimise the danger of disaster, but you also might need it to replenish ecosystems and keep them functioning. That's an example where actually this different framework for thinking about that human nature connection feeds into really quite directly into practices that minimise the possibilities for harm and are oriented towards ecosystem resilience.
All right. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the hour. Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking Professor McDonald for today's.
Thanks so much. Thank you.